A moment seared into memory.
We can't see who has been hit, if anybody's been hit, but apparently something is wrong here. Something is terribly wrong.
I am in my second grade class at St. Albert the Great Catholic School in Louisville, Kentucky.
Barbara Perry recalls that Friday in late November 1963, her class was working on an art project in preparation for Thanksgiving the following week.
The project was coloring pictures of pilgrims. And all of a sudden, I looked up, the teacher turned towards us and said, "The president's been shot. Please line up, we're going to church to pray for him."
It's official now, the president is dead.
The news hit home, especially for many Catholics like Perry's parents and grandparents.
That week, then, as we got together for Thanksgiving, they were speaking about President Kennedy as if he were a family member.
Early childhood memories of JFK paved the way for a career. A professor of presidential studies at the University of Virginia, Barbara Perry has written numerous books on past presidents, but her favorite is Kennedy, and she's not alone.
Even 60 years later, if you look at polls, Kennedy will often be at or near the top.
Starting in the late 1940s, Kennedy took major political aspirations to Washington. He would serve as a U.S. congressman, then senator. During his time as a lawmaker, he lived a few miles from the Capitol building in the Georgetown neighborhood, first moving into this apartment where he could walk to Mass at Holy Trinity Catholic Church. But his hope for the White House was complicated by his faith. Anti-Catholic prejudice was alive in America. When Kennedy was just a boy in 1928, politician Al Smith, a Catholic, had run for president.
And he was vanquished in a landslide by Herbert Hoover because he was Catholic.
People were afraid of having a Catholic president?
They were afraid of having a Catholic president because they said the Pope would run the country.
Those fears continued up to the 1960 presidential election.
Because I am a Catholic.
So 2 months before Americans would vote, during a pivotal speech in front of Protestant pastors in Houston, Kennedy said he believed in an America where the separation of church and state is absolute, and he clarified his Catholic faith would not influence his presidency.
I am not the Catholic candidate for president. I am the Democratic Party's candidate for president, who happens also to be a Catholic. I do not speak for my church on public matters, and the church does not speak for me.
The speech paid off. On the morning of January 20th, 1961, John F. Kennedy started his day with Mass at Holy Trinity Church and later gave his inaugural presidential address to the nation.
And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country.
For the first time, a Catholic moved into the White House.
It certified that a Catholic could be accepted in the highest office in the land, and that was a really important barrier to break.
But at the same time, political science professor Matthew Wilson, a Catholic himself and director of the Center for Faith and Learning at Southern Methodist University in Dallas, calls the JFK presidency a mixed blessing for the Catholic Church in America.
It came with a price because it showed that a Catholic could only be accepted if he was willing to leave a significant part of his faith at the door. Separation of church and state does not mean the marginalization or the sidelining of our deepest values that are derived from our religious faith.
The values JFK derived from his faith may have ultimately shown up in some of his policy, from his support of civil rights, social justice, and potentially avoiding a nuclear war by seeking a peaceful end to the Cuban Missile Crisis. But he was explicit about this.
I believe in a president whose views on religion are his own private affair.
He was president before things like abortion and same-sex unions, both contrary to Catholic faith, would be widely debated in political forums. It's unclear how his views about those issues may have impacted his political decisions. But since Kennedy, Wilson believes a pattern has emerged. People of faith elected to public office, both Democrats and Republicans, often sacrifice or misuse faith convictions for political purposes.
Time and time again, they choose party over church. They choose party values over religious values.
For Kennedy, the separation of his personal and public life may have gone deeper than just politics. In the limelight, the many photos show off a charismatic family man. But there was another side hidden in shadows at the time.
So we've seen the pictures of him with his wife and his children. So was he living a double life?
Yes. He was an incorrigible womanizer and cheated many times on his wife, Jacqueline Kennedy. So yes, he led a promiscuous life in his personal life.
That could lead to more questions about how deep his faith convictions really were to begin with. Even so, Perry says Kennedy continued to keep a spiritual routine.
President Kennedy, throughout his presidency and throughout his life, went to Mass religiously every Sunday.
According to the First Lady, her husband also went to confession sometimes, and though he may have had his own doubts about faith, he prayed.
Yes, he probably had some questions about his faith, but she said every night he was down on his knees saying his prayers.
For weekend getaways, John and Jacqueline Kennedy, along with their two children, Caroline and John Jr., would spend time outside of Washington in the countryside near Middleburg, Virginia. So in the early 1960s, St. Stephen Martyr Catholic Church was completed with the president in mind. A storage closet by the entrance was once a safe room built by the Secret Service in case of emergencies. Inside the sanctuary, a plaque now marks the president's pew. A number of photos show the Kennedys walking to and from Mass, but those Sundays wouldn't last long. In the spring of 1963, this church was dedicated, but that fall, tragedy would strike. On November 10th, John F. Kennedy attended Mass here for the last time. The family was all together. A picture captures the moment as the Kennedys walked into church. The following Sunday, on November 17th, a quick trip to West Palm Beach, Florida. There, inside St. Anne Church, a newspaper photo still hangs, showing a smiling president as he was leaving Mass. Just 5 days later, he was in Dallas, riding along in the fateful motorcade.
President Kennedy has been assassinated.
The nation mourned as the president's funeral mass was held at St. Matthew's Cathedral in Washington. His young son stood outside the church, giving his father a final salute. Today, the floor is marked where the casket lay before President Kennedy was buried in Arlington Cemetery, as the marker reads, where his remains lie in expectation of a heavenly resurrection.
People were praying for him, for our country.
Monsignor John Ensler, a Catholic priest in Washington, was a high schooler in '63. Reflecting on the life of Kennedy now, Ensler sees it as something of a cautionary tale for all modern politicians on both sides of the aisle who proclaim the Christian faith yet reject it in aspects of their personal life or public policy making.
Sin is like a cancer. When you fall into a sin, it begins to eat away at your very being.
That's a warning for everyone, but the mercy of God extends to all. Monsignor says to not accept forgiveness and reform our lives would be the real tragedy. For as much as death brings mourning, it would be much worse to make choices that reject eternal life.
The tragedy would be to lose your soul, to say, I've not been able to enter God's kingdom because of my actions, because of my decisions, because of my rejection of what in conscience I know is right.
Mark Irons, EWTN News In-Depth.
This is not all of our reporting on the John F. Kennedy legacy. Mark has an extended version of this report, which will be released on the November 22nd anniversary of the assassination. It has additional content and context and can be seen on the EWTN YouTube page.